everyone, welcome to Bridging the GAAP, a podcast brought to you by the Governmental Accounting Standards Board with our host, Matt Broder, Vice President of Communications at the Financial Accounting Foundation. I'm Eileen Foley, Senior Manager of Digital Operations, and I'm excited to be here with GASB Chair Joel Black for the second part of our series introducing GASB's post-implementation review process. Joel, welcome.
Thanks, Eileen. It's always great to be here with you, and we're very excited for this second episode in our two-part series on the post-implementation review process, or PIR. The first episode was about the process overall. This episode will get into the results of one of our reviews.
So Joel, what did that review actually cover? And do you mind sharing with us a little bit more about who Matt will be speaking with today as well?
Sure. That review covered our pension standards, which include GASB statement number 67 and 68. And Matt will be talking to Tammy Waymire, who is a senior research manager at the GASB and was very involved in the pension PIR.
That's awesome. I look forward to hearing more about that. All right, then let's go ahead and listen in as Matt welcomes Tammy to today's episode.
Thank you so much, Joel and Eileen. Welcome, Tammy, to Bridging the GAAP. We are going to start today, I think, just by reminding our listeners about GASB's original pension project. What was it? When did it take effect? And what new information did that pronouncement provide to financial statement users?
Thank you, Matt. It's a pleasure to be here with you today and talk about the culmination of this pension post-implementation review, or PIR report, that the staff just recently completed. And probably a good idea for the listeners to start with a background of the pension project. That project, probably a lot of our listeners remember some of the basic provisions, but it would have come along in 2008, added to the board project or technical agenda at that time, resulting in two statements by 2012, Statement 67 and Statement 68. Statement 67 addressed the accounting and financial reporting for the public pension plans, and Statement 68 addressed the accounting and financial reporting for the government employers. And what most people will probably remember is that those statements resulted in recognition of the liability, the pension liability, directly on the face of the financial statements where it had previously been disclosed. So it's somewhat of an elevation of that content from the disclosures or the notes to the face of the financial statements. It also involved some changes in the measurement of how that liability was calculated. And so there were some provisions around the discount rate and additional provisions related to required supplementary information, additional information for users to place that newly recognized net pension liability into context. And it all sort of followed the issuance of two concept statements 3 and 4, that address communication methods and elements of the financial statement. So it was a time to sort of refresh the existing pension standards. But they spanned every aspect of financial reporting, those two statements did.
Yeah, so what I'm picking up from what you just said is that, first of all, this has a very long history. I mean, it's going all the way back to 2008, so that was 16 years ago. And I guess the other thing that I'm picking up is that, you know, what the GASB really did was really elevate the level of transparency around these pension liabilities that states and cities have, you know, around the country.
That's right. And I think just by placing those liabilities directly on the face of the financial statements, and I know we'll get to this, but that was one of the benefits that users perceived with that change in the reporting.
Yeah. So that's obviously a big step forward for transparency and for users of government financial statements. When your colleague Alan Skelton was on our show at our last episode, Alan, of course, he's the Director of Research and Technical Activities at the GASB. He shared with the listeners what the three basic objectives are of a post-implementation review, or the PIR, as you said. Maybe just take a minute, if you would, to just refresh our memories on what those objectives are when you start a PIR project.
Sure, glad to do that. The three basic objectives are, first, to determine whether the standards are meeting their stated purpose. And there are 5 sort of sub-objectives that go along with that main objective. The second one is to evaluate the cost of implementing the standard and with the kind of ongoing application of the standards, as well as the benefits that users get from that information. And then the third and final objective is to evaluate whether the post-implementation review or PIR team finds that there are any recommendations that they may have for improvements to the standard setting process, and then those would be communicated in the report. Within that first objective, sort of breaking that down, the pieces of that first objective about whether it meets its stated purpose include whether it resolved an underlying need for the financial information that's being reported. Second, whether there's decision useful information being provided. And then there's also whether the statements are operational. And with as many things that were going on with the pension standards, there was a lot to evaluate there. And then the fourth and the fifth are sort of associated with whether there are any unexpected changes to operations or financial reporting or any unexpected consequences. And I think it's important to point out that when we get to the second objective and think about cost and benefits, that we're measuring relative to the cost and benefits that the board contemplated at the time. That's sort of our reference point. And I think it's important with respect to the third objective to think about the fact that we're not necessarily making recommendations for changes in the standards, but recommendations potentially for changes in the standard setting process.
I see. So these are pretty foundational questions, and I'm wondering, like, actually, I mean, from almost like a mechanical standpoint, how do you actually try to answer these questions? You've got to get information. Do you conduct surveys? Are you meeting with stakeholders? These are big questions, and how do you actually pull the information together to try to begin to answer them?
This is a good question, and I think you could ask us the question, do you do the following outreach activity, and fill in the blank with almost anything, and we would say yes. We have a kind of a wide range of things that we do in post-implementation review, and particularly in what Alan described in the first podcast about this, what we call stage 2, which is the post-effective date evaluation of cost and benefits. During that stage, we're primarily drawing on 4 main methods for evaluating the standards. Those include things like roundtables, where we'll have people around a table, stakeholders from different groups. We tend to think about preparers, auditors, and users, but because of the comprehensive nature of the pension standards, we also would have included pension plan representatives and actuaries and benefits consultants as well. And so they'll be around a table virtually, because that happened unfortunately during COVID, so we weren't together in a room, but it was a virtual room where those individuals had an opportunity to talk about their experience with the standards, whether they're coming at it from a user perspective or preparer perspective. We also did a whole host of surveys. We would have done cost surveys, we would have done those with preparers, so they would have provided us with information about what it cost them to implement the standard, even in the preparation leading up to, including the implementation, and then after implementation. And then we did other surveys with all 5 groups, so those are pretty pervasive set of surveys. And then we also would have collected some archival data. So when we talk about archival data, we think about it in terms of extracting information from the financial reports and evaluating whether we're seeing what we would expect to see based on what the statements tell us. And it's got some limits associated with the archival data. We can't really tell whether a government is reporting something accurately or completely, but it does give us some sense in a lot of cases of whether they're able to operationalize the standard. So then the last piece that we do, and I come at it, as you know, from an academic background, that was my training that I love, is we engage with the academic community. So we do a synthesis of the academic literature to evaluate whether there's anything that they found about unintended consequences associated with the standards, or things with the implementation, things related to cost, and we'll evaluate that literature and sort of synthesize it. And in the case of the pension post-implementation review, we even reached out to a couple of researchers who had applied for a Gil Crane Memorial Research Grant and awarded them a grant to study trending and discount rates, so we will engage with them too. I think it's important in that mix to think about the fact that how we structured is meant to get objective information. So the pension post-implementation review team consisted of people who weren't a part of the original project.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so we try to, it's a way to sort of insert a little objectivity.
Right.
Doesn't mean that we don't use the individuals who are subject matter experts, but we make sure that the individuals who are leading the effort, that would have been Jalon Sue, that she was independent of that project originally. So we do some things to make sure that there's independence in the process.
Yeah, and I know the GASB has another sort of quality control method or system, if you will, which is your technical inquiry service. This is when people who are trying to implement a standard who maybe are running into a challenge or a question or a problem, they can reach out to you guys and say, I'm struggling with how to interpret this particular standard. And in the case of the pension standard, I mean, do you use that information as well in the PIR?
We do, absolutely. And I love that you asked that question, because we do the technical inquiry service for any standards that we issue. For the ones like pensions that are pretty major, we have the more formal PIR, or I like to call it the uppercase post-implementation review. And we use those technical inquiries as a way to gauge how well preparers are able to implement the standards. And we'll take questions from preparers and auditors and users, but it's primarily preparers and auditors who use that service. One of the things that we did within this PIR report is use those technical inquiries to trend them. So we looked at them over the period of time before implementation and all the way through implementation. And we saw a trend that you see in a graph in the 49-page report that the listeners could access on the website that is what you would expect it to be, that the technical inquiries, and we got maybe 2,000 of those over that time, big number. So a lot of work on the part of the technical staff, and those were individuals who were associated with the project originally answering those questions.
Right.
But we saw what you would expect to see, that when they got past the year of implementation, the technical inquiries tended to drop. That suggested to us that there was learning on their part, and that the educational outreach that we did and the issuance of implementation guide Q&As was helpful. It suggests overall, back to kind of objective one, that it was operational.
Right. So you've got all this information together in the PIR process. What actually did you learn about the standard and how well it's being used and adopted and implemented?
It's a great question. So I think about this in terms of where I was in 2008 when the project was put on the board's agenda, and I was just finishing my PhD and starting my first academic appointment at Northern Illinois University and teaching governmental accounting. So for me personally, I would have been following the standard through the invitation to comment, the preliminary views, the exposure draft, and the ultimate standards. But you're really looking at it just about how to teach it, and maybe at a level that the staff here would consider to be kind of a 30,000 feet view.
Right.
So for me personally, it was a great learning exercise into a lot of the things about the implementation of the standard and the provisions within it, and even how the processes work at the GASB to get a standard issued. I would say for the team as a whole, because we all came at it from a background of having not been associated with that project to start with, we all had a whole lot of learning on the technical pieces, and we also had the experience of looking at what the board contemplated. So getting that feedback from the outreach, the roundtables, the surveys, and so on, and lining that up with what we saw in the basis for conclusions in the statements themselves to figure out whether the things that were happening were things that the board contemplated. And in general, what we found and what we learned is that it was generally consistent, that over that 4 years in the due process from 2008 to 2012, when those statements were issued, that they had sort of ferreted out all of the big issues and knew what those were. So there were really not any blind spots associated with the conclusions that they reached.
Mm-hmm. So just to kind of maybe stay at that 30,000 foot level, what ultimately did the GASB determine about the pension standard? Is it in fact achieving its original purpose? Or in other words, did it solve the problems that it was designed to solve?
Yeah, absolutely. The short answer to that question is yes. If we go back to the three objectives at the outset, it met its stated purpose for those two statements. The cost and the benefits were as the board contemplated and consistent with what stakeholders expected at that time. I think they expected the cost to be significant, and they were.
I got it. Okay.
Yeah, so they were big,
Yeah.
and the benefits too were big, and so there was a reason for doing it. So what we found was generally consistent with that. So for those two objectives, we concluded that it had met the standard for those two objectives. I would say that is not to say that there are no remaining disagreements among the stakeholders out there. There continue to be disagreements among stakeholders, and you'll see this in the report itself, that there are still very differing opinions about what the discount rate should be, for example. Mm-hmm. But the board contemplated that. They knew that at the time, and those disagreements still exist, and there's nothing that was suggested out of that something in the standards could have been different to get everybody to be happy. Everybody being happy was not necessarily the goal.
Achievable. Yeah.
Achievable, that's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. So what comes next? The post-implementation review is complete. Is there, for a major standard like this or like these, is there a post-implementation review, or is this pretty much now kind of settled law, as it were, and future changes or improvements to the standard will be just in the due normal course of the GASB's business?
That's a great question too, and I think a lot of listeners probably have that question. For us as the post-implementation review team, Jalon and Danielle Pollock, and the countless number of postgraduate technical assistants who've helped with this project along the way, it was a finite project, and the post-implementation review and the report is completed. It's been presented to the board, it's been presented to the trustees, and all of the information, even where the disagreements still exist, are memorialized in that report. We didn't have any recommendations. That original third objective is to evaluate whether we need standard setting process improvements. And we didn't identify any of those. There's always room for kind of continued improvement, and we'll certainly take what we've learned here and apply that to post-implementation review projects that we have going forward. In terms of pensions, it is finite and complete. Should the board want to take on a project, that would be entirely up to them to put that on the technical agenda, but that's not in the plans at this point.
Understood. Great. Thank you. Well, Tammy, thank you so much for joining us today and helping us all better understand this really important topic in GASB land. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Matt. Appreciate it.